some quick sound tests just to make sure everything still works. Week 9, week 9.
Test on my end. Test on my end.
Test.
All right, perfect.
Alrighty. Sounds good. Alrighty. Welcome back to the Anime Podcast. We took a quick 1 week break for two reasons. Number one, we both had some our in real life commitments, but number two, we also essentially had an issue with a couple of shows where we wouldn't have been able to complete the pace, finishing up the show at the end of the gauntlet. And we wanted to be able to give each show like a essentially equal playing ground when it comes to discussion about how the series went overall. And so doing a 1 week break allowed essentially the shows that were lagging behind to now catch up. We will still be doing essentially the ninth episodes of the animes that are still in the gauntlet. And yeah, with that being said, excited to dive in this week and see who we have for our contenders.
Yeah, because we have a small list, we only have 8 contenders left. So this will be number 1.
Alrighty.
And to no surprise, it is going to be Vivi, Fluorite Ice Song at number 1 again. I gave it a score of 9.5. You gave it a score of 10, which I think is now the record in our show. For a rolling average of 7.85, a big increase, right, of 0.24. Why'd you give it a 10?
Yeah, I honestly think that like this episode, in my opinion, was like pretty much as well executed as an anime episode could be. I genuinely think that like there are when we discuss like let's say like best anime episodes of all time, there will always be slight differences that come alongside the what you would I guess perceive the best episode to look like based on kind of like how the rest of the series is going and all that. I will say
Mm-hmm.
that the reason I gave this a 10 is because I think that within the framework of the story and the genre, I honestly could not pick out a part that I didn't think was like basically flawlessly executed. You
Mm-hmm.
have all of it combined, right? Whether it's the very adept writing that I have to compliment the mangakas and the writing staff for the way that they did this show's format and kind of like the premise really set up this incredibly poignant and like just emotionally charged finale, right? We have this the way this episode ends up concluding the storyline not only of Antonio, right, and his whole thing and AIs and their dreams and all that, but also essentially Vivi and Diva's, how that finally comes into play and seeing Diva, seeing that go over between the sound effects and the visual effects of like the fight scenes incredibly crisp, just like really 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 like I will say that I can very confidently say that this is the best action we've seen in the spring anime gauntlets. All these episodes, this has been like the best action I've seen just when it comes to like animation fluidity, like the impact you feel like of like the contacts and all that type of stuff. All the way even to like putting the way that they use the music right towards the emotional finale of the ending, like it just of the ending of the episode is just like incredible and like honestly like it's this show is very quickly, in my opinion, approaching, at least for my anime personal book, like one of the greatest, like yeah, like easily top 10 of all time type of deal. And I yeah, what did you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. This show was amazing. This episode in particular was
Yeah,
amazing. I'm a big fan of like sound effects, especially
yeah,
during these fights. And
mm-hmm.
you're right, the sounds were crisp. Like you could hear the noise of every punch that was blocked, every
Yeah,
kick that was made. And it was, yeah, I agree, by far the best action sequence this gauntlet, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think what the show does so well in its writing is that it does a good job in creating these mini arcs and
Yes.
building up to these arcs. Because I'm looking at my past scores the previous 2 weeks, and they weren't the highest score for the show. It was actually
Yep.
my two lowest scores of this show,
Yep.
5.8 and 6.5 last
Yep.
2 weeks. But it was all for the build up for this episode. And I think
Yep.
Vivi does an amazing job in writing so that it does these things. And now it has 4 episodes left, right? 10, 11, 12,
Mm-hmm.
13. And so there's like one arc left,
Yeah.
and we're not even there at the high point, in my opinion, right? We're gonna
Yeah.
see something even higher. And
Mm-hmm.
just knowing that, like, this show is just so exciting and so engaging.
Yeah, but just for
Yeah.
perspective, like yeah, it's like even if like the storytelling in of itself is already so solid that even if the animations and like kind of like the technicalities of the show, even if they weren't as good, this would still be like one of like my favorite shows already, just based on like the story elements alone. But like when you combine it with just how well the animation studio has done, just like with the anime, like this is one of those ones where I am kind of curious, like I would imagine that your experience as a light novel reader or as a manga reader would like you're missing out on essentially kind of like this
Oh
added
yeah,
layer, right? And yeah, just like
definitely.
like it like reminds honestly like just to, to praise the like the visual technicalities even more a little bit, like legitimately like some of like the ways like like the ways like the like your experience felt as like let's say like blows were landing and stuff like that reminded me some of like more of my favorite video games, and like the fact that an anime can come close to that level is like just incredible. Yeah. Like
Yeah,
this.
and this I don't know about you, but this
Yeah.
week the across all the shows, the animations were kind of weak in my opinion. There
Yeah.
was lots of
Yes.
ugly shots in a
Yeah.
lot of shows, but this episode was very clean for the
Yeah.
most part.
This is like it was almost like a almost by virtue of contrast, like you notice, especially at least for me, I noticed like with this one's just like oh my gosh, like Wit Studio just like completely knocked it out of the park. Yeah, obviously we have show finales yet to be seen, and we will not be making the call till we reach the end of the gauntlet. But
Yeah, yeah.
I would be very very surprised at this point if any of the other shows would even be able to catch up to this, like just because it's just like I cannot rave enough about how amazing like this episode was, and kind of like as by extension the series up to now, like just yeah, completely just crazily good. All right, for the next
You
one
can introduce this one.
yeah,
Yeah.
we have 86. Still at number 2, and Aston gave a score of 6.4. I gave a score of 7. The rolling average dropped by 0.03. Pretty much stayed the same at 6.92. This was. What did you think of the episode? What did you think?
Yeah, I think it was interesting because there are parts that I disliked and parts that I
Yeah.
enjoyed.
Mm-hmm.
I did not really understand fully the whole like the sticky arms kind of situation.
Yeah.
That I felt that was kind of
Yeah.
random.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, I felt like a lot of the moment between Undertaker and his brother were a little.
Yeah.
I don't know. I didn't feel as emotional
Yeah.
with them. Like the way it's animated and the way the
Mm-hmm.
dialogue was going, it was a very emotionally charged reunion. But I guess I didn't feel it at all, that much. I think the impact of killing the big
Okay.
brother wasn't
Yeah.
heavy, and that's I think primarily because the character kind of distanced himself from the brother because of that choking
Yeah.
incident.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think I feel for the brother as much.
Yeah.
Um, right?
The storytelling of this episode was interesting because I think even though okay, this is kind of like almost like the technicalities were executed pretty well. I think like the fights, like
Mm-hmm.
they were executed pretty well. But like I would almost argue that like the storytelling for this one, it's kind of like it's gotten like a little bit reversed, right? It's like after we see like the brother have all this like this weird like plasma arm thingamajig happen, and then
Yeah,
have
yeah.
him eject and all that, then we go back and it's almost like the show then reminds us as a viewer how this older brother connects to every single character, right? They show this
Mm-hmm.
afterwards, right? Which to be fair, like it's not like it would have been that much more impactful if they showed at the beginning of the episode then showed that, because like it's like
Sure.
doesn't give us a lot of time to process. But to kind of build off your point of like, oh, like the older brother's just an older brother, like he's not like like some like crazy epic
Yeah,
character where
yeah,
we
yeah,
have like
yeah.
feeling a ton. It exactly mirrors that, right? Because it's like after right, we see that stuff. You then see the scene of where she kind of like the main character or one of the Mrs. in the background kind of manip-
Yeah.
emotionally manipulates her fellow whites to like to help her with the mission, right? And he reminds. Essentially, we then find out that like the example that that this comrade gave about like essentially saying that like like everything's meaningless and blah blah had directly
Mm-hmm.
related to the Undertaker, right? And so she's like, like like do you want to really let him die like a second time, right? Do you want to let him down a second time? The show does a lot more flashbacks about how Undertaker and and older brother are supposed to be related, but these like all get sequenced like a little bit after or like literally like as it's happening, right? Which is like still not bad.
Mm-hmm.
Like I still think like at least like we did get to see some nice things, and I do think that like I guess sequencing aside slash like writing aside, I do think that this is pretty much executed as well as it could have, which is why I still give it some props. That being said, once again, like it does kind of to build off your point, right? It's like I feel like it's like a little bit like not as potent from a writing perspective as it could have been, right? Like your emotional
Yeah,
impact of it.
it's a little
Yeah,
over
yeah,
dramatized.
it's over dramatized. Most of the emotional gut punch that you're supposed to feel comes from the visual effects, right? Where it's like, oh, like here's like a rainbow
Yeah.
color, super saturated rainbow color background with black scribbles on it, and then whatchamacallit, then the scribbles disappearing, right? Like it's a lot of the
Disappear, yeah.
visual is supposed to make you like really have this feel of, oh my gosh, like what, like this, it's like you're supposed to feel a lot. And like don't get me wrong, like I still felt something, right? Like it still feels nice to like see like kind of like this emotional like happen,
Mm-hmm.
right? But
Release,
like
yeah.
yeah, like emotional release, but it's still at the same time like not quite like
Earned.
as yeah as earned, right? Which is why I
Yeah,
think
because
like
I when I
yeah,
think
go
of a
on.
similar situation, right? And what was that show? A movie, Silent Voice. Remember at
Yeah,
the ending of Silent
yeah,
Voice, where all the exes dropped? That was a very huge impact
yeah,
because of the story and how it's set up. Whereas this one, it's like I wrote here, like we didn't know about the brother till a few episodes ago. This fight against the brother only lasted for like 10 minutes
yeah,
tops, and so it's like, oh, okay, I guess 10 minutes is enough to show the intensity and how hard he's fighting for his brother. But it's like the fight with Vivi lasted like 20, like almost the entire
yeah,
the entire
yeah,
episode is fighting, and so it's
yeah,
like it's hard for me to believe the emotions. I mean, I recognize it's there, but
yeah,
I just have a hard time believing it.
yeah. It's yeah, I think like it's still decent. I think another interesting comment that we actually we kind of talked about a little bit before the show was like we were discussing about the number of episodes that were there, and this was actually one that has 11 episodes. And
Oh,
after hearing that, it made a lot more sense because I also did get the feeling of like the story. Okay, not trying to be too vulgar, but like essentially it kind of like it's it blew its load. Like it played all its cards already,
it
right?
hits
Like it's like
climax,
yeah,
yeah.
like the like most of the cards, like all the shots are already fired from the revolver, right? Like that type of stuff. Like and like at the end, like it makes sense to me that like there's only 2 episodes left because at this point like they're just kind of closing it up. But I guess like it's for what it did, it's still like nice and pleasant, and I think that that's why it still got like a decent score because like it was executed decently.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, alrighty, and at number three.
Yeah, we have those Snow White notes. Still at number three, no changes. I gave it a score of 7.8. You gave it a score of 7 for a rolling average of 6.88, a slight increase by 0.06. I personally quite liked this
Yeah,
episode. We kind of knew that this was a big
yes, this
climax.
was like what we're gonna see. It's kind of like the shonen, like like the
Yeah,
like
exactly.
kind of like very stereotypical, like oh everything's building up for this moment, right? This is
Exactly.
I think the first time you've actually given it a
A
significantly higher
score.
score than I have.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
explain that. Yeah.
100%. Yeah, I think these are the moments I kind of like enjoy watching when it comes to
Yeah.
slice of life episodes where it's like
Yeah.
this climax.
Yeah.
And I think it would have scored such a higher score if like they fixed some stuff, right? There were still
Yeah.
issues about animations,
Yeah.
lots of still shots, lots of solo shots, a lot of anime moments that I
Yeah.
keep bringing up
Yeah.
with this
Mm-hmm.
show. But I did enjoy the watercolor portraits of each cast member
Yeah.
when they were doing
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
panning shots.
Yeah.
I enjoyed the. I actually enjoyed a lot of the little sister, that
Okay.
character,
Yeah.
because I think
Mm-hmm.
her character arc is the most compelling of any
Yeah.
character in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Because she has her eyes set on beating the main character,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and then technically she finally did beat him this time, and
Yeah. The
then they
individual,
award the
the
special
award. Yeah.
character,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
like, oh, did I really beat him?
Yeah.
So there's that. Also, I want to comment. It makes no sense to have a special award after giving out the actual third, second, first place
Yeah.
awards. It's like
Yeah.
specifically for the
Uh,
show to
yeah. Yeah. I.
work. So I
Yeah.
ding the show a little bit for that. But other
Yeah.
than that, the music
Mm-hmm.
was great. I enjoyed like the cast members like really playing with each other, and I
Yeah.
was like, oh, I like it. And I think all the buildup was kind of leading up to this. So
Yeah. Yeah. I personally think that like I was pretty satisfied. I will say that like I guess the unrealisticness of just tossing in a special award in the middle of the
mm-hmm.
awards. I
Yeah.
guess for me, like, having experienced this type of stuff is like literally like would have never happened. Like I've never seen this type of stuff happen. So that was definitely worth of note. I will say that I am still expecting that the shows. Okay, this is kind of like there's going to be two finales I imagine kind of for the show when it comes to like, or rather two climaxes. One is going to be like essentially the slice of life school one, and I am actually pretty satisfied with how they pretty seemingly wrapped it up. Right, it's like it's a pretty nice, like, feels good. This is kind of like how it goes, and like we finally get to see them all like working together. And I will say that like it's not like the most elegant, mind-blowing fashion, but like they did handle it enough well to the point where it's like, oh, like things that we see about the characters are finally all getting tied up together, and like it feels nice, right?
Mm-hmm.
They back it up through nice visuals and all that, right? But like it's definitely like,
Yeah.
okay, like it feels good, right? That's the one finale I am really, really anticipating, and I'm hoping that now, since he has, if we're going to be honest, right, like the way the story sets it up, the slice of life is like it's a core feature, right, of like the genre and therefore of the show. But
Yeah.
the bigger story, right, essentially him running away from home because like his grandfather is no longer there.
Trying to
The
figure out the
journey of him
sound.
trying to like the sound, that one's still up in the air, I think, for the individual one, and I'm really looking forward to see how they execute that one. I think that it was, yeah, I think there was a tiny part of me that like almost kind of wished they like hammed it up even a little bit more, just in anticipation of that finale. But I mean, like
I mean, there's still
yeah,
three episodes.
there's still 3 episodes,
Yeah.
right? So like like there's still plenty of time for like kind of like a climax to build up. I
Yeah.
will say that like just kind of not necessarily as a comment of this anime episode specifically, but just of the anime as a whole. Some of these, shall I say, notable these other notable musicians, right? Like whether it's a guy with glasses that's on the poster, so one of the other dudes that like the one that like greeted him when he was sitting under the tree. Like,
Yeah.
I will say that like, I mean, there's still 3 episodes left. We can see. I kind of almost wish like we like got a little bit more screen time of them. Like they seem to be very like supportive cast characters. The most development we've got to see out of supportive cast characters, I feel like, are of his older, like his relatives, right? The older brother,
Mm-hmm.
his mom. Like, but like besides that, like it's like we still don't see that much of kind of like the other musicians, so to speak. We got a decent amount of exposure, albeit a little bit dragged out of the classmates that are in the poster, right? But like I feel like
Yeah.
yeah. So we'll see how it goes. I will say that like, yeah, I still think that like it's, this anime is definitely, in my book, a very decent music anime. I think that it incorporates like music like well enough to the point where it's like it makes it kind of like part of the enjoyable experience as a whole. But yeah, top three still there. Definitely, I have huge hopes. We'll see what happens with it, but I'm hoping that like I feel the same way about this show that I did like like the first episode. Like that was like actually
Mm-hmm.
was crazy, and I'm
Yeah.
hoping
Yeah.
that we get kind of like a return to form over there. Alrighty, at number 4 we have Odd Taxi. Taxi, Manatsu gave a score of 7.1. I gave it a score of 8. The rolling average has climbed up by 0.12 for a total rolling average of 6.6. What did you think of the episode?
Yeah, this was I think the first half, or I guess the first two-thirds of the
Yeah.
show, did a good job in kind of connecting more points, right?
Yeah.
The main character Urakawa finally rescues Kakitani, the
Yeah.
monkey, from
Yeah.
the whole
The
thing. We
Badger
kind of,
game. Yeah.
I think, yeah. At
Yeah.
this point, I think we've already tied up the arc for the hippo guy,
Yes. Yes.
because he finally decides to not do social media anymore. He's like, I need to kind of live for myself, figure out
Yeah.
myself. I'm like, okay, cool. So we're already done with an arc, and there's, I mean, still so many more arcs to go through. But
Yeah.
I think overall things are getting more intense,
Yeah.
especially the ending. Like
Yeah.
I thought we were done with all the mysteries, and we were just trying to figure
Yeah.
out how everything will
Yeah. Kind of like
tie
resolve.
together.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then now we figure out that there's something special about Urakawa.
Yeah.
There's some sort of foundation that
Yeah.
exists to support him.
Yeah.
Both of his parents are dead, and his best
Yeah.
friend, the gorilla,
Yeah.
doesn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have no idea what this is.
Yeah.
What are your guesses on that?
Yeah. Number one, I still heavily compliment. I think the continued interesting build up of the mystery aspect, right? Like this is like a story that's a
Yeah.
plot line from like an overarching like mystery plot line. Like I'm so very engaged. Like I really want to know what's going on. I think that they do introduce elements, but they're also not like almost kind of like, shall I say, like pulled out of left field. Like it feels like very
Yeah.
properly like introduced and organically
Makes
introduced,
sense.
like where like it's like very believable. I will say that this episode's the the talk between the gorilla thug and the hippo guy, I think that was like such a good, like holy crap. I was like, damn, this like that moment reminded me like really well of like what I ultimately think is like kind of like the gem of this
Mm-hmm.
entire gauntlet of this season when it comes to dialogue. Like I think that like that piece, even though it's only like 3-ish minutes long, like I think it's just so well done where it's like you have a nice balance between heartfeltness and, shall I say, just kind of like almost like the gritty realism that the show like really like tries
Yeah.
to like encompass, right? That like the almost like the brutal, very straightforward, uncensored like style. And yeah, like Molly, like I thought that was just like so, it was just such a treat to watch. So
Yeah,
yeah.
the show does a good job in not making the characters one dimensional, right? I think
Yes.
that's a big flair of this show is that the characters have depth, and to see like,
Yes.
oh, the hippo, who's all about social
Yeah.
media, really struggling with himself and
Yeah.
his identity. Uh, Technically the mafia person in
Yeah.
Nobu
Yeah.
is telling this kid like
Yes.
what he needs to do, the mentorship and stuff like
Yeah.
that. It's like, okay, just because you do bad things doesn't mean like you're dumb and you don't know how the world works, right? It's like, no,
Yeah.
he's really smart. He knows what to do. He just does bad business, right?
Yeah, but it's like the
Um,
person. It's like a very, the person has a very enjoyable depth. I think that's also earned because we like get to see enough interaction between him and Motokawa, right? Like and
yeah,
it like
exactly.
makes a lot of like it like makes a lot of sense. Where like like sure he isn't. They didn't swing the pendulum too far the other way, where he just ends up turning out to be like a complete angel. But like
Hmm.
there's a very genuine side of him that like it's like empathetic about being true to yourself, right? And
Exactly.
like
Hmm.
and so yeah, I thought that was like executed very well. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's this show. I am also This is also one of the shows I'm just like like I have a very very deep curiosity for figuring out kind of like what happens next. I definitely kind of want to see the at least the storylines kind of like tie themselves up. But yeah, I think masterclass on dialogue. Yeah, continues to be.
I agree.
Alrighty, at number 5.
Yeah, number 5 is Koikimo. It's still at
Yeah.
number 5, but as you can see, it is my lowest score for this week. I gave it a score of
Yeah.
4.4. You gave it a score of 6. Forward rolling average of 5.89. Just a slight dip at 0.09. So the reason
Yeah.
I gave this my
Mm-hmm.
lowest score, I think the first 80% of this week's episode was not to my liking.
Okay.
I think one, the animation was not the best.
Okay.
There were a lot. I mean, okay, I already explained how overall the animation was really kind of sus. But
Yeah.
this episode was, I think, one of the worst offenders of it.
Okay.
A lot of still shots, a lot of background shots where the faces are kind of the eyes are distorted and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. So it's really I can really tell like they're not. I guess they just ran out of time,
Mm-hmm.
production issues. Not a big fan of the dialogue at the beginning.
Okay.
Like
Yeah.
what
It's
I
like a little
forgot the
bit
guy's
overhammed up.
name. Yeah, the guy
Yeah.
was like, "What if I asked you to go out
Yeah.
with me, even
Yeah.
if you like someone else?" I'm like, "Who
Yeah.
asked that?" And then it's like,
Yeah.
and then, "Oh, can I have your permission to still like you?" I'm like, "You see, I don't understand what the whole point is for that. Like, I don't understand that. Like, no, she said no. I don't understand. You can still like her. You don't even have to ask her for that. It's you're liking her." And so I just did not like the whole that dialogue and them trying to figure it out in the classroom. I guess is okay, but at the same time, it felt really off. I thought it was really weird,
What
the
did you
way the dialogue.
What did you think of that dialogue essentially getting mirrored for, you know, Mr. Boss Guy and his coworker?
So I really like the so I said the
Yeah.
first 80% was like whatever.
Yeah.
The last 20% was actually quite. I'm glad that they addressed the age gap really clearly, right? Because
Yeah.
they're like was the coworkers like, but aren't you guys different ages? Like, how is that gonna work?
Yeah.
I was like, good. Someone needs to really ask him because like
Yeah.
his sister supports him, right? So that's
Yeah.
whatever. So this is the first time I feel like he's being confronted by this issue of the age gap. I'm
Yeah.
like, thank goodness. I mean, episode 9 is kind of later in the season, but I'm like, okay, yeah, think about it. Like, what is your actions like? How does that affect her? And that's what he was struggling with this episode. Like, oh,
Yeah.
I'm acting a little immature. I was like, yeah, no crap. And you're a middle
Yeah.
aged man too. So I don't think it's like, I don't give it a 4.4 and think like the show is gonna go downhill from here. I think it's like, oh, 4.5. I don't really like this episode, but I think the ending kind of sets it up for a good episode next week, in my
Okay.
opinion.
Yeah, I think this is interesting. Where like I think I took that dialogue. Both I would argue that I felt like it was kind of mirrored both ways. Where
Mm-hmm.
essentially we had we had the dialogue between the high schoolers, right? The high
Yeah.
schoolers, and that was being kind of like really cheesy, like asking for permission to still like, kind of like being really, shall I say, like it's like a very it's a very, I would argue, a very East Asian as type of like just really, really like undefined boundaries, like very like kind of like it's okay. As a Western viewer, I have the exact same reaction like to you, right? Where like if like I'm kind of like very, I was raised in like a Western context, and like to see him like ask these type of questions, just like dog, like holy shit, like
Well, I
yeah,
see, but I've been raised in
okay.
an Eastern, yeah, Eastern
Would you
household. So
would you say, I think like, because I do think that there's like a difference between well, I would say like East Asian, and more specifically I'd say like almost like a borderline like a Confucian s type of thing, where it's like, oh, like it's all about like, like there's very little personal agency, like like there needs to be a lot more like shall I say, like a collective. I feel like, okay, like
but
it.
I don't think that I don't think that really greatly affects the reason why someone would be like, can I still like you? I think that's just awkward conversation, in my opinion.
I think that it's supposed to be noble, okay, like it's supposed to be like a noble thing to like ask that, and from like an East Asian perspective, it's just in reality it's like, dude, like the fuck, like like it's like this is whether you choose to like her or not, like doesn't have like, instead of like, I would have much preferred to be like, yo, I just want you to know that I still
See,
like you, right?
so the
Like
reason
in the
why
sense like,
the reason why I wouldn't say like East Asian, this could just be a mangaka kind of thing because
okay,
I have not, and I mean I haven't watched that many anime
okay,
shows
yeah.
out there, but I think this is like the first time I see someone asking permission to like, can I still like you?
I like see this like in, okay, I actually, off the top of my head, I can't think of any animes that have done this, but I've seen plenty of Korean dramas, Taiwanese movies, Chinese movies that have done this, I think. So now that I think about it, I don't think I've actually seen an anime do this, but this is like, this specific line of like, oh, can I still like you, actually does appear, like I said, in some of
Okay,
these
I
other
could
East
see that.
Asian,
Yeah.
these other East Asian elements, and so I see that and I just go, like this is just kind of like, like a thing, like I said, like at
Yeah.
least in the, okay, like if you were to like try to like imagine them as real people, like culturally speaking, like it's almost like supposed to be noble that the guy like asked for permission for this type of
Yeah.
thing, but in reality, right, or like let's say for example in my Western lens, like in this type of situation, like instead of saying, "Do I have my permission to like you?" It's like, dog, like that's just you. Like you can tell her that you still like her, right? Like just want you to know that like I like you. That like is just as elegant and like like it's just like not as like awkward and just like makes a lot more
Yeah.
sense given the context, right? So I think like, and then I think that was almost very similarly mirrored too to essentially how the conversation happened between the adults, right, the middle-aged ones. I think that like it's very interesting how essentially she goes, oh, like like you still like it, but then she tries to like kind of like push it a little bit more. I did enjoy the adult iteration a little bit more because it's backed up by, once again, like you said, like the freaking elephant in the room that's been in there like the whole entire show. Like finally we're talking about it. And so like sure, like is it a little bit like is it a little bit like a tiny bit over dramatic, like maybe a little bit, but like I do think that like overall, like I'm also willing to just kind of like give that a pass because it finally addresses the elephant in the room, right? And like if for nothing else other than to at least put the question into the viewer's mind, we finally address it. So yeah, I think the dialogue overall is still like, I think like from a slice of life perspective, like the voice acting and kind of like the visuals. I'm not gonna talk about the animation, but I'm saying like kind of like I guess like the vibe overall, like the aesthetic of the show, like it's like still done pretty decently. Yeah, I mean at this point, I guess we'll just kind of see where it goes. And yeah, it's still Koikumo has solidly stood up, I think, in the top contenders one, just because it's still a pretty solidly produced show overall. But yeah. Alrighty, at number 6. So
You go
so
for it.
yeah, to your eternity, is still staying at number 6. Manatsu gave a score of 5.5. I gave it a score of 6. The rolling average actually still stayed exactly the same.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that this one was it. I'm trying to think of how to describe this. I didn't 100% expect the show to dwell on Gugu, is that his name? Gugu this long?
Yeah, Gugu.
Yeah, I didn't expect the show to dwell on Gugu this long. I was, not to say that I didn't enjoy it. Now that I actually kind of like almost taking a step back, I do think that the moments that are outside of, shall we say, like the Sphere's mission end up being kind of like the more palatable moments. Like I think like for example, like at the end, right, like let's say that at the last 2 minutes of the episode, we get to see once again he's fighting against the adversary again, and the narrator deity says, oh, you haven't accumulated more power, so this is going to be a shitty fight, and like we see some of that. But with that being said, like once again, like it almost feels like, I don't know if it's just like the fact that the show focuses so much on something else and then kind of just tosses that in there or something like that, but like it ends up actually feeling like a little bit less there's less emotional connectivity / buy-in for me as a viewer when I see that type of stuff. It almost feels a little bit more of just like, oh, here's like a question box, let's see what happens. Like there isn't like a for a show that's allegedly supposed to be focused right on the kind of like the evolution of a sphere and how this identity acts as the new world. I still feel like I don't have a lot of base work for, shall I say, like the power structure / power universe of this story, right? Like like obviously, right, like we can't compare this to shonen because shonen's like just take like a ridiculous amount of runtime to explain what chakra is, to explain what Rietsu is, like all that type of stuff, right? Like what Nen is, all that type of shit. But with this show, I still feel like there's kind of like a little bit of a lacking where I feel like there's still not a lot of engagement on that front. That being said, if we were to kind of take a step back from that, surprisingly, and I didn't expect this at all, I do think that the interactions of kind of like almost, shall I say, all the characters that he runs into, especially with Gugu, like I said, like a pretty long focus on that. I still think it's done pretty well. I think that the interactions between Gugu, and the girl that he really likes, like I think it's like pretty cheesy, but still pretty well done.
Yeah.
And so definitely still appreciated that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I really. So as someone who's read a lot of the manga, and I kind of can guess, because this show is 20 episodes long for the season, and so I kind of already know what arcs they want to cover.
Okay.
I didn't really. I was when you were like, oh, they're taking a long time focusing Gugu. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I never really thought about it that way, just because I kind of know the context of like the arcs. You're right. In terms of emotional buy-in, we don't really see much progression. As a lot of the interaction, a lot of the past few episodes has been his interactions with Gugu.
Yeah,
I'm looking at the past scores. We got a peak of 7.8, like week 5, at least for me, week 5,
yeah,
and it's been a while since we have had a high
yeah,
score.
hmm
So I'm wondering if this battle with the adversary, this
yeah,
which I'm assuming is going to be this next
yeah,
episode, how that's going to change the pacing of the show.
yeah,
Because the narrator did bring up a good point. Like you didn't form any relationships, you have no extra powers.
yeah,
So how are you going to fare this time? Because he won last
yeah.
time, but if his power is still the same, so it's like okay, I guess he might lose someone and then now has to live his life without that someone.
Yeah, like technically speaking, right? Like they're okay. Once again, this kind of like is like a whole like I still don't feel like the power universe is super established in the anime version, but right, like if
Yeah.
we to think about the battle last time, essentially he had to exhaust through all his forms to eventually beat the
Mm-hmm.
fight. Yes, obviously this isn't technically a rock paper scissors, but since I don't know, like at least I feel like as an anime only viewer, I still don't know exactly how like kind of like the power structures are supposed to line up. Technically, if this was a rock paper scissors like kind of like shall I say relationship, he still does not have one extra form as last time, right? And you can only assume
So yeah,
the
so I actually
yeah,
realized the only power that he has now is the ability to create stuff with his hands. He kind of figured that out because he was creating
okay, yeah,
food. So that's I guess the
yeah, yeah.
only
I guess
power
yeah,
he's had.
yeah. So I guess we'll see there. Maybe like the deity doesn't realize that he's gotten a little bit more familiar with it or something like that. But yeah. Overall, yeah, I mean, I guess it's pretty interesting. So, do you know off the top of your head for this iteration, like for spring, how many episodes it has, or does it just
For
keep on going? For
It'll keep
spring,
on going because it's
okay,
it's 20 episodes, so that means it's gonna go into fall.
okay,
I mean, yeah, into
okay,
sorry, into summer.
summer into summer, okay,
Yeah.
alrighty.
All
At
right,
number
at
7.
number 7 is Shadow's House. I get a score. It's still at number 7. So far no changes to the top 7. I give it a score of 5.5. You get a score of 5 for a rolling average of 5.67. So it went down by 0.05. Your thoughts on this week's episode?
Um, I guess okay. I wasn't like super disappointed by it because I do think that like kind of like all the arrows were pointing towards this. I kind of like this type of thing. I
Yeah.
will say that I feel like there's like it feels like it's just still like it's a very weird combination of just watching Miliko be wholesome in sunshine and like
Yeah,
a
yeah.
tiny bit of like kind of like story pieces that are tossed in here and there. Like I feel like
I
like
agree.
yeah, and even surprisingly, the fact that I still say this, even though Miliko has a lot less airtime, this one in comparison to the other ones, we had the whole thing where we have Patrick and John and like that whole Boulder blah blah blah, like that whole thing that happened. The didn't have a Miliko, and still at the end, like it still felt like most of like the shall I say the meat of the show that isn't just like almost expository still ends up like it's
Yeah.
it's just like a Miliko being in sunshine cutie like, and that's just type of like what it is. I think that I will say that I'm not too optimistic about there being too much substance for the last like couple of. I think this was one that's gonna like already has like multiple like future seasons, right? Or like at least has like a future
Yeah,
season.
we already know that the manga's still running, and
Okay.
so this is
Yeah.
just the end of the
Okay.
first,
Yeah.
I guess,
hmm
big arc.
Yeah. I'm not too optimistic of the arc kind of like having too much more sauce. I guess like or like extra stuff coming out. Essentially, we do see that it's like oh yeah like like this is a whole thing. There was one thing that they kind of like once again through dialogue kind of like split a little bit where they're like oh like eventually like is harmony that important when it's supposed to be a takeover, right? And like the one of the
Yeah,
guys
yeah,
says that, so like I mean we'll probably just see kind of how that plays out, but for the most part, it kind of like closes up like almost like the mystery of it. And I will say that I almost kind of wish that they like revealed that in a slightly more dramatic way than the guy just like saying it.
hmm
But I mean, yeah, I mean so.
yeah. So yeah, from my end, it's like, uh, the lore wise or the plot
Yeah.
wise, is like the only thing that kind of solidifies, like, okay, yeah. So it seems like the shadows take control of their dolls, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Uh, with that interaction of that lady there who
Yeah.
had her tongue sticking out.
Yeah. Hmm.
I think we also is that the first time we see the who I
Yes.
presume is the Lord
Yeah.
Grandfather.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
I think
And
so.
so other than that, I think what the show is missing that it
Hmm.
kind of had, I guess, earlier on maybe
Yeah.
was like a real sense of a conflict.
Okay.
I just don't. Conflicts are great because it adds suspense
Yeah.
and the viewership, also a
Hmm.
chance for the characters to like grow and develop.
Yeah.
The conflicts don't feel like
Yeah.
they exist because I feel like Emilico always has the
Yeah.
answer.
No, it's like literally the counter to every like slight discomfortable spat is essentially Miliko's wholesomeness like takes over the situation, right? Which
Yeah.
is like it is kind of cute, right? It's like but like that's yeah, it's a show very
Yeah. So
devoid of conflict, like relatively speaking.
yeah. In terms of like intensity, it's just out of all the 7 shows we've talked about, I feel like
Hmm.
this is definitely the least
Yeah,
intense.
the
Like
least
something
intense. Yeah.
needs to happen in the show for me to be like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that happened. Because
Yeah.
right now, like nothing has happened to help
Hmm.
to give me that reaction.
Yeah.
So we'll see in the next couple of weeks. I hope it has one of those moments because if it just continues like this, it's like I can see it like go down for sure.
Yeah. Alrighty. And those are the last of the contenders. We have Tokyo Revengers at number 8. Manatsu gave it a score of 4.9. I gave it a score of 5. The rolling average went down by 0.07 for 5.54. Um, I will say that, like, even though it is, I mean, it's nice to kind of, like, see the story move forward a little bit. This show was mostly, shall I say, like, pretty much just the brawl, right? Like, if you, like, think about, like,
This episode
yeah, this
or in
episode.
general?
Sorry.
Yeah.
This episode was just literally just the brawl, right?
One. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I think that like for a show that is supposed to have a lot of moving pieces about like like how are you supposed to interact with the present, the future, how your choices make an impact and stuff like that. Like, is it like kind of cool to see like how some street thugs like beat up on other street thugs? Like I guess it's like mildly interesting, but like that's not why we're here to watch this show. I'm like a little bit disappointed that like they took up like the entire runtime just to like watch some goons beating up on each other. It's kind of like okay, like this is like
Yeah.
yeah, like this like legitimately like there isn't like I'm not 100% sure. How do you know how many episodes there are for this one? Or is it just gonna continue to go forward?
I think this, if I'm not mistaken, is the only show on AniList that actually does not know how many episodes it has.
Okay.
Because if you hover over the AniList photo,
Yeah.
it'll tell you like, oh, out of how many episodes.
Yeah.
And Tokyo Revengers is the only one that doesn't know, which
Okay.
which means typically that the show has not stated or the studio has not stated how many
Okay.
episodes there are.
I see. Interesting. Yeah. So I mean, at least for, if I recall correctly, the manga is still going, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So I mean, maybe the arc will be settled essentially of like, oh, like here's how like Tolman and this whole thing is gonna kind of continue to play out. Like maybe this is just gonna be like, oh, like essentially resolved not successful. Here, wait for the new arc is like my guess at this point. But yeah, like it was kind of disappointing to me how it's like it spent the whole like I said like it spent the whole time doing something where it's like this. I feel like most people aren't watching the show to like watch some like hand to hand combat like
Yeah,
yeah
and it's just and yeah, not just that. It was also like, oh, it's like one versus whatever, and like,
yeah
oh, more people came from Mobius. Like, ah, look at that, we're outnumbering you, and it's like,
and
just wait, we'll
yeah
fight you, and then all of a
yeah
sudden, they come. It's like, oh,
yeah
our people are here too. I'm like, cool. You can literally
yeah
do that in like 2 minutes. I don't know why you spent
yeah
20 minutes,
exactly
like
right like
10 minutes
yeah
doing that,
yeah
right?
like it like took like an inordinate amount of time. It is interesting to me that essentially Mr. Person on the bicycle. So if you're looking at the picture, the person whose back is facing the one who's opposite direction versus everyone else, right? So the person on the bicycle, we got to, or the motorcycle rather, we got to meet him a little bit of last episode. We get to see him a little bit in action. We see the Mr. Fuzzy
Yeah.
guy, top left, the trader on the top, the top middle left. Like we finally get to see some of the people that are in the poster like get introduced
Yeah,
this
yeah,
late in, which is also kind of weird. Like I said, like I'm hoping that they go a little bit more into the characterizations, besides like here's some fighting style stuff. I'm like afraid that
Yeah.
like the
That's
fighting
that's what it
styles.
was to. That was
Yeah,
for this
like
episode. That's what it
literally,
was,
yeah.
right?
It's like oh, like we like see like some fighting styles, and like I guess yeah, like I said, I mean at this point since we don't know how many episodes there are, not sure exactly how it will end, but yeah. show still got me hooked on figuring out kind of like really wanting to know what happens. I do think that this one was just like a really weird um, pacing episode.
Yeah,
So
pacing
yeah,
because they're still technically stuck at the park, so
yeah,
nothing has moved on
yeah,
really. So
pretty much yeah. So
it just needs. It's on the chopping block right now, right? This show
yeah,
and Shadow's House are on the chopping block, so we'll see.
yeah. Alrighty, and the drop
The
list.
drop list. So it's the bottom five shows of this week. So if you've already memorized who exists or who are still in the running for the Gauntlet, then you'll know who the bottom five is. But
Yep.
we'll start off with the creme of the crap, which is Mars Red at number 9. It's gone up one spot. The first time we've had movement in this Gauntlet this episode. This week. I get a score of 5. You gave a score of 5 as well for a rolling average of 5.51. It went down by 0.06. What do you think about this week's episode?
It was. Let me put it like this. I think I was almost spoiled by like the episode where we essentially have the English theater vampire, right? And that whole episode is just like,
Yeah.
so amazingly well done. Like just I think like in the parameters of like a very hammed up drama, like period drama type of thing, like pretty much
Yeah,
as
yeah.
good as it could have gone. I think we got spoiled a little bit by that, and this one is very. I don't think it's 100% unnecessary context, but I do think that once again this is like it was very like okay, like there's just not too much happening, so we're gonna try to establish stuff for the future, and that's just kind of how I felt, right? We got teased at the very end. It's like oh finally, like this is the shit we wanted to see,
Yeah.
right? It's okay now we have MC, right? He had this super like huge beautiful moment of dealing with the soldier, right? And like you have see the conflict of him of like being a zombie versus being a vampire versus humanity. We get to see extra
Yeah.
layers of it now, on the episode of the English performer, and we get us all of this stuff, and this character is now incredibly complex, and it's like we finally see him, and he gets teased in like the last 10 seconds. It's like like I wanted to see more of that. It's like damn,
Yeah.
this is kind of what I was like hoping to see more of in this episode. I do think it's not entirely unnecessary to kind of like establish up maybe a little bit about how the other characters are faring. Essentially, I feel like this episode was just like putting some groundwork for like here's how the rest of the gang is doing, like post like essentially unit dissolving.
Earthquake, yeah.
Like proposed unit dissolve, but like yeah,
Yeah, I thought pacing was a little bit weird for this one.
yeah,
The whole misunderstanding about it's someone who's copying his voice. I'm like, okay,
yeah,
that's kind of random.
yeah,
And we find out it's like the other vampire that's trying to trick them into
yeah,
infighting. I did like the fact that they addressed the kid vampires,
yeah,
why he's killing them.
yeah,
And I was like, wow, the kid vampires, they don't grow up because once you turn into a vampire, you just stay at that age.
yeah,
And so it's hard for them to survive. I'm like, interesting. So he understands that and just kills them just to end their misery, which is like, okay. At least he has a little bit more depth to his character,
yeah,
Sua. But then the ending, I was like, okay, we all knew he was alive. There's no reason to make it
yeah,
like a secret. I'm
yeah.
more of
Like
him because his whole character development and the history behind him is like I think the best part about the show.
yeah, exactly, right? Like I think that like I would almost argue that the show puts most of his chips into his character, right? Because
Yes.
he is a representation of essentially the premise of this, right? Of
Yeah.
this Japan that is dealing with
Exactly.
this vampire stuff like that, and he is like the perfect. It's almost like the perfect, the perfect mirror, right? Like it's like and so yeah, I mean, I can't wait to see more of like how his character gets handled. I really hope they don't flub it. I have
Yeah.
decently high hopes. I hope they don't flub it.
It's a 13 episode, so there's 4
Okay.
more episodes
Yeah, so there's
instead
four
of
more
the 3.
episodes.
So.
Yeah, and like I said, I think at this point, since it's survived this long in the Gauntlet, and we are already very accustomed to it essentially being a very drama-y period drama, I have a suspicion that the ending is also going to be very like dramatic and stuff like that. The ultimate self-sacrifice type of thing. But I do think that if it's executed well, it'll still be like a pleasant. It'll still go down in my books as like a very like like a well executed anime within the parameters, so to speak, like within the genre and like the type. Yeah. Alrighty. And at number 10, we have Burning Kabaddi. Dropped one spot. You gave it a score of 4.4. You're tied for your lowest score. I gave it a score of 5. Rolling average is 5.48. To give it a drop of 0.1. What did you think of this episode?
Yeah. So now that I think about it, I think one of the big reasons why both of my lowest scores of this
Yeah.
week got their scores is because
Yeah.
of really bad animation.
Okay.
Uh, Burning Kabaddi, I think one of the reasons why I always have a high score for it is because it
Yeah.
does really well in animations. Like the lining is solid, the colors are great.
Hmm.
This episode was so ugly. So many still shots, weird eyes, crooked eyes,
Yeah.
like far off shots. They didn't do
Yeah.
close ups as much. So I was like, I did not feel it. Your one of your strong points became your weak points.
Yeah.
They did a small origin story of the duo, the strong duo,
Yeah.
which was pretty nice. Whatever.
Yeah.
And I think it came to a point where it's like it felt a little too shonen-y for me. In the middle of the
Interesting. Yeah.
show.
Yeah. That
And no,
is.
I
Yeah. Go.
Yeah, and I came into this show like with that lens already, so I was like, okay, I'm enjoying it. But then it was like a little bit too much for me,
Yeah.
so it was like, oh, this kind of sucks. We are approaching the training arc, part of the shonen where he's gonna teach them
Yeah.
each a move, which I'm like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
But in terms of character development, not as much. And so yeah,
Yeah.
it's starting to lack a little bit of the strengths that it had going for it, in my opinion.
I see.
So yeah, that's why I gave it a low score. It was just poor animations, a little bit too shonen for my taste. Not much like development, in my opinion.
Yeah. I think it's it's almost like I'm kind of conflicted because on one hand I agree with you where like it's like really freaking shonen-y this episode. It's like
Mm-hmm.
almost like over the top, like just like dude, like holy crap, like oh he has two tough guys, like literally like you could like have like a very simple AI like chatbot write this dialogue and it would like come out like this, right? Like
Yeah.
it's like very stereotypical. I do think like at least for shonens, I am kind of like on the camp of like if you're gonna watch a shonen, you might as well lean into like the fucking cheesiness and kind of like and so I think like that was the only reason it like didn't get like a super low scores. I think it's like oh like within like the shonen genre it's like okay I guess I'll give you a pass on like it's like okay like somewhat okay. That being said though, I have never been a particularly I've never been particularly drawn to shall I say like the animation aspects of it like
Mm.
I even for me who doesn't usually pay attention to this stuff also did notice that like this one just like very like a lot less so like animation focused than the previous ones. And this is
Yeah,
coming
not
from
much
somebody,
action.
yeah, which is coming from somebody who like really didn't watch the show to be wowed by that type of stuff, and I still noticed it, which meant like you know like there's a pretty I would argue that's almost like evidence of like there's like a pretty notable drop
Mm-hmm.
in terms of like the animation quality. So yeah, honestly, I don't really expect. I'll just be honest and say that like you know now essentially with 9 episodes in, like I'm not expecting too much out of this. Like it's just like, very run of the mill shonen is kind of like the label I'm more leaning towards putting a stamp on. But yeah, at number 11.
Yeah, at number 11, it is Higashiro, our weekly drop list resident.
Yeah,
At number 11, again, it has moved up one spot. I gave it a score of 4.9. You gave it a score of 6 for a rolling average of 5.28. So it's gone up by 0.02. Um, so 4.9 for me is one
yeah,
of on the lower end of this week.
yeah.
I think a reason why is because in terms of character development,
Okay,
it went into the past a lot, and so in terms
okay,
of current
yeah.
development, there wasn't much.
No.
Really, nothing really big happened. We just kind of knew
Hmm.
in terms of flashbacks what happened, which I think is great in itself.
Yeah,
But in terms of the episode, it's not really that strong. Like I don't
I
think.
see.
I think it better prepares it for next week's episode.
Yeah,
But I
I
think,
yeah.
yeah, go for it.
This episode to exactly kind of hop off the point of shall we say like setting up for the future type of theme. A lot of past, right? Basically 90%, if not 95% of the show essentially of this episode, sorry, is just flashbacks, right? Of like what
Mm-hmm.
previously happened. And I it's kind of sad, but like I appreciate this episode because I felt like it like almost like put a stamp of like somewhat a modicum of realism onto the premise of the show.
It does. It
Yeah,
does. Yeah.
I think that all the way up to before, like, even if there were certain, shall I say, like, nice moments that I think were executed well, right? Like, for example, I think, like, what was it, like the third episode where, you know, it's like really intensely, like, here's, like, you know, like the raw sexuality and, like, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
how
Third
they
episode.
navigate that, right? Like even though there are some episodes like that, like, I will still just say, like, I just, my bone to pick with this show always has been, like, dog, like, this premise is just so fucking ridiculous. Like, it still just seems like a, almost like a, so I say, like, almost like a really weird weeb fantasy type of
Yeah. Yeah.
premise. I think that this was the first episode where they've actually finally kind of like grounded it down, and, like, sure, is it still ridiculous? Kind of, but, like,
Yeah.
at least they've now, like, attached enough substance to it where, like, it doesn't bother me now in the back of the head anymore. So
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
episode
Yeah.
to me almost felt like, you know, it's like kind of like a setting the slate clean slash setting up whatever happens in the future, which really ties into your theme. You know, talking about, like, you know, sure, like, this episode in and of itself wasn't like, you know, the most notable, but, like, I do think that, like, I appreciate it a lot. Like, at least for me, it felt like this show now, like, I can have a little bit. I don't have to pull back as much when I watch this show, just because, like, all the way up to this point, like I said, like, it's still just like one of the most, like, ridiculous kind of, like, dude, like, this is like, you people, like, how can you possibly buy into this crap? Like, and it's kind of like I said, like, it doesn't, like, just straight up make it, like, super, like, just immediately, like, I would say it's still not quite like Koikomo level of, like, oh, just, like, you know, should I say more like buy into a bull premise, that type of stuff, like, more
Yeah.
realistic, but like, it's almost kind of, like I said, like, put enough substance to where it's like, okay, you can kind of, like, makes things a little bit more believable, and for future development and character interactions, like, there's gonna be now a little bit more weight behind them, right? And so,
Yeah, I think what this show should be at least gonna. I feel like the topic that they need to talk about
Yeah.
in the next few episodes is Sayu dealing with her grief,
Yes.
with the suicide of her friend,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
because now that we know what happened,
Mm-hmm.
she has never processed it yet,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
She was pretty much empty. Her mom was like, "Why are you putting us in detention?" Yada yada.
Yeah.
So because of her, she ran away, and even when she ran away, she ran out of money, and then she was like, "Okay, whatever I do, I'm kind of like an empty shell," and then bumps into the guys, and that's what happens. How she starts the cycle of sleeping with guys so that she could have housing. And all of that, she still has not processed the grief of the death of her friend. And so I hope they go into that in next week's episode, because she was having fun with the main guy character, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And, like, really enjoying her time there and her friends.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's great and all, but she still needs to process that grief.
Yeah.
And so I hope they focus on that the next few
Yes.
episodes.
And my biggest fear with this show is that they decide to, like, it's like okay, moments where, like, I feel like this, we've already commented on, like, how we feel like the mangaka, like, almost has, like, moments of, like, almost seems like transcendent, where it's like, oh, like, he actually, like, seems to understand social interactions pretty well, stuff like that, and then it gets, like, pulled back by, like, some bullshit that happens. You're like, never mind, this guy's still kind of, like, you know, should I say, like, super anime or whatever. I'm really hoping that they spend the rest of the show focusing on her dealing with the trauma, instead of focusing on, like, unfortunately, the way the episode was finally set up was like, oh, what are you going to do about her, like, about you and her? And I was like, oh, come on, like, literally, it's like, okay,
Yeah.
I get that, like, there's like there's like the romantic, the title has a romantic undertone and all that type of stuff, but it's like, please, like, it's like, come on, like, in a real scenario like this, like, the stuff that you should care about more, what's more wholesome for her, and, you know, it's just like the romance shouldn't be on top of her mind, right? Like, it's on top of Sayu's mind, and so I'm really hoping it doesn't go that direction. Unfortunately, like I said, like, it's kind of like, it's like inching towards that a little bit. I'm getting a little bit worried about it. We'll see where it goes, though.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there.
Yeah. Okay. Super Cub.
Yeah, go for it.
Number 12. It technically went up one spot. You gave it a score of 4.5. I gave a score of 5. The rolling average fell by 0.05 to a total rolling average of 5.18. I can't say I'm disappointed, but I also can't say that, like, I'm lauding it by any means. It's kind of like the best way to describe this show. I think that at this point, it's kind of like there's don't get me wrong. I think like just purely as, shall I say, a work of art, and more specifically, almost shall I say, like it's kind of like to go back to the quote that we like overused in describing this, but like the silence between the claps, right? Like it's like as a demonstration of that artistic phenomena, I think it continues to do a pretty good job, right? Like I think like there's like the pacing of like the dialogue, the stuff that they're going through. Like for example, right? Like like their frustration with like needing to add this ugly windshield thingamajig on top of their things they really don't want to do. I think like the pacing I really added a lot without having them talk too much, or you can kind of like feel it. I still think that's
Yeah.
all executed pretty well, but it's just also like such a I think that, for example, right, like if we were to talk about like Miyazaki films, right, like sure, there's plenty of claps between like silence between the claps, but then there's also like a lot of clapping, right? And I feel like we
Yeah.
just like haven't had like that, like, and we're already very close to we're already in episode number 9, and I feel like it's just like the show like is not never steps outside of the bounds of like I guess like shall I say like the very established pacing to try to like introduce something more, right? And it's just like I said, like it's just like
Yeah.
yeah, it's just
No,
like
I agree with you.
yeah,
There's no, again, the same problem with Shadow's House. There's not
yeah,
a big conflict to kind of excite things. I'm
yeah,
thinking back to, so we compared Super Cup a lot with let me try to find that show. Let's Make a Mug too,
yes,
right? And between the two, I still think Let's Make a Mug 2 excites me more in terms of the
yeah,
conflict that happens, right? There's like, oh my goodness, what's she gonna do with, and this kind of sucks because now that I'm thinking about it, like, oh my goodness, I want to figure out what happened. But like, she was disappointed that her dad didn't like her pottery,
yeah,
right? And so it was like, there's that emotional depth to it. Whereas
yeah,
this show, not as much
yeah,
intensity,
yeah,
very slow paced.
yeah, like very slow pace. Like I said, like like it's like I said, like the silence between the claps done pretty well done, but it's like the clap is always at a very solid metronome pace, right? There's never like a more higher frequency, right? Which is like once again, like if we were to
Yeah.
use a quote, right? Like if we were to take Miyazaki's work, like like there's plenty of clapping in some parts, right? It's like because it's like you need more stakes, right? And I think that that's just kind of like what the show doesn't have. But yeah,
Yeah.
like I said, like I still think that from like just purely from like I guess like a technical analysis of of what we are doing in terms of kind of like the art medium, still does a pretty decent job, but that's kind of as much as I am willing to say about it. Yeah, and then at number 13.
Yeah, it is Duran, the Princess of Blood and Snow. Technically, has also gone up by one spot. Uh, Primarily because we dropped. What was that show we dropped last week? It was Nagatoro was high up
Yeah,
there, which is why a lot of these
yeah.
shows jumped up by one. I gave it a score of 5. You gave us your lowest score of this week, which is 4.5 for a rolling average of 5.07. Why is it your lowest score of this week?
I would just say it the shall I say the almost like the reveal and Joran's turnaround of like essentially her boss guy being oh like he's not who you think he is. I just felt like it's just so like I don't know, it just felt like so unearned. It's kind of like fucking like out
I'm
of
honestly
left
still
field.
confused. Like, why is he helping her? I
They
still don't understand. I still don't understand why he's bad. Like, what did he do that was bad? I don't know.
Okay, so the fact that we're sitting here talking about this exactly goes to show how like it's impossible for that moment to be earned because nobody knows what the like, or rather the show
Yeah.
makes it very difficult to even understand what the hell is happening. Okay, from my understanding, okay, he may actually have taken some of this tribal blue stuff because when she
Okay.
slices him, the blade doesn't go all the way through, and you see an animal pattern underneath, and you also see him having some symptoms of essentially, shall we say, like something like a negative drug reaction or some shit like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
like, just from context, because it seems like to me, it's like she thinks that he's his ally. In reality, like he has this kind of like his own agenda into her, the inexcusable aspect, right? I don't know if you like remember, like essentially the reason why she goes up to him and then she does that whole thing majig where her blade doesn't actually go through him and then like like you see that pattern on the
Yeah.
back is because she saw some of the blackmail material that was left by the treasurer, right? The treasurer, or rather the person with like the extremely good memory. She like left like a
Oh,
couple
was
pieces
that
of
was
blood.
that was that the thing? I thought that was a clue left by Tsukishiro.
Well, that's like so. It was left for Tsukishiro in the case of
Oh, I see, I
right,
see.
right, right.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I'm saying like it was left for Tsukishiro, and then she stumbles upon that clue, like info that could take down the organization, and then like I said, like just from context, because it seems like even though this guy's supposed to be like this whole thing about like he's just this father figure that wants to enable her to get her revenge. Well, now if he's actually taking some of this stuff, then he's just as evil as the rest of them, right?
Okay,
Yeah.
so I just read some of the Reddit posts right now because
Oh,
I
okay.
mean we were talking, so I was like, I
Yeah,
want to
yeah,
figure this out.
yeah.
Because the show this week was a little bit slow. Like she goes
Yeah.
back to her village, talks about
Yeah.
her village. It goes back to
Yeah.
the library where she used to work, talks about that.
Yeah. We see the artificial mod assassin that came from her village.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
Like that's whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so someone pointed out. So we know that he took the blue blood, right?
Yes.
Because he was like experiencing
Yeah.
the scars on his back. I had no idea what that was.
Yeah.
And the way it's animated, we're supposed to know what it is.
Oh, really?
Those,
Okay.
I mean, in my
Okay.
opinion, right,
Okay.
the way like they show it's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay, this is significant.
Yeah.
Someone on Reddit said on the week 9's post, isn't that the scar that Joran saw? I call it Joran, but what's her
Yeah.
name?
Yeah. Uh.
Sawa.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah.
Those are the scars of the person who massacred her family.
Oh. Oh yeah. It is. It's
So
one matching. It's a matching of the snake dude or whatever. Yeah.
yes, and
Mm-hmm.
so that's a scar. And so this whole time we thought it was Janome that massacred, right? And she wanted her revenge on Janome.
Mm-hmm.
But it could be this
Yeah.
guy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I
Okay.
know I
Yeah.
didn't
See.
know. I didn't realize it.
Yeah. See. Same. Like it's like now that you point it out, it's like oh yeah, technically he did have essentially like a cross patterned scars. The person
Mm-hmm.
like, but yeah. I mean like I said, like I will be honest. Like I feel like I'm like a quote unquote decently observant show watcher, and I still didn't catch that either, right? Like the most I was able to catch out of it was that like oh like clearly like like I said like all the context clues are pointing that he has taken the blue blood at some point. He's receiving some of the negative like the negative repercussions of it, and then because of that when she finds out the secret, he is not who she thinks he is, and that's why she attacks him. And the reason the blade doesn't go all the way through is because he's also powered. That's all I was able to glean, right? Which is like to be
Mm-hmm.
fair, okay, like I guess like there's just some substance there, but like it's just not like emotionally like it's not earned, right? It's just kind of like it feels like
Yeah,
it's kind
yeah.
of like there's like all this random crap that happens literally in the last 45 seconds of the show, right? Where like she like goes to the thing, sees it, meets him, blade doesn't go all the way through, scar pin like a over dramatic little shot of the scar, and then blah blah. Like it's like it just feels like it's not earned. I feel like at this point, like I've always my sentiment with this show always has been that like there's kind of like some parts that I really dislike about each episode, but then some part that really shines. This was
Yeah.
the first episode where I think that I didn't have a part that I heavily disliked. I actually think that setting up the context of specifically, kind of like having the like it's not really like a foil, but having a extra dimension being added by essentially the mod assassin, and then kind of like having like this other perspective on what it is like to be like a contract
Yeah.
killer or whatever, right? That was
Yeah.
actually like somewhat semi decent, but this is also the first episode where I felt like the quote unquote the wow moments like just like didn't feel as good as the other ones,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
why I ended up giving it a lower score. The first time I've not given this show a 5. I think we like talked about this before, how this one's like the most consistently average like scoring from me, and like this is the first time I've deviated from that because I feel like it's like the first time where I felt like it was like the ending didn't feel enough emotionally impactful. And to be fair, it the way it's written is supposed to kind of set up for something that happens next episode, right? But yeah, the
Yeah.
fact that you had to look up a Reddit post for us to even like get that last piece of a connection, the fact that I was watching it and like I could kind of get some conjecture in based on context clues, but then I apparently missed the juicy part of this is the mark of like the people that killed her village. It's like definitely unearned in my opinion.
Yeah. And that is the drop list for this week.
Alrighty.
So if you go to the next week, next slide, these are the 5 episodes that we are gonna drop because we are at odd number week. You get the honor of dropping the first show.
Yeah. Oof. Alrighty. I think that Mars Red, um, I there's no way I'm personally gonna drop it because like it's almost kind of like the the meat was teased like right at the end there. I was just like, oh, like I really really want to see what's happening. So at least for me
Yeah.
personally, I'm not gonna be able to drop Mars Red until at least I see the next episode and kind of like see how that man's storyline plays out. I think
Hmm.
Higehiro was an interesting episode. It is a tiny bit of morbid curiosity, but I do think a morbid curiosity of like, oh, like I want to see if they kind of, like I said, like in my opinion, blow up. They blow the psychological realism of the show by focusing on the romance between the two instead of on Sayu's like recovery.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
there is definitely potential. I do think that if they do point in the right direction of her kind of like her journey of trying to find healing, that it could be decent. So I'm not gonna drop that show either. I will say that between the last three, so Joran, between Joran, Super Cub, and Kabaddi, they're all shows I'm willing to drop. And so it's I I'm gonna drop Burning Kabaddi. I think
Okay.
that it's I don't have the mental strength to continue to watch what I know is about to be a training arc that I think will be extremely ZZZ, like just very like boring. I think that like um, I feel like out of all the shows, this one and Super Cub, I feel very comfortable in saying that like I pretty much know what's gonna be left to the
Mm.
video, right? I think Joran, there's still like a tiny bit of twists. I did give it the lowest score of the week because I was kind of frustrated with how I was going. This technical is still a little bit more to look forward to in terms of Joran in my book. So that's why that was staved off, and then it was honestly pretty difficult between those two. But I'm gonna pick Kabaddi.
All right. So I'm the one. I prepared the slides. So
Okay.
I knew what the drop list was, and I
Okay.
already knew the one show I wanted to drop.
Okay.
And I wasn't sure if you were the one that
Okay.
was gonna
Yeah.
drop it. You did not select the show that I was going
Yeah.
to drop, so I can select this.
Yeah.
I will be dropping Super Cub.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's just too slow,
Yeah.
slow paced. It doesn't excite me as it
Yeah.
used to, and so I'm just dropping it.
Yeah. I think I think it's like I described, right? Like out of these five, right? The Mars Red, Hero, and even Joran to a less extent, but like still a little bit. Like I feel like those shows, there's still like something more to look forward to. I feel like there's just very little to. It's okay. The path forward for both Super Cub and Kabaddi are just so extremely predictable that like yeah, I think
Yeah,
it's
I
makes
think that's
sense why
fair.
those were the ones that were selected. Um,
Alrighty. If you go ahead and refresh your slides,
I'm
you
assuming
will
none of us will
see.
be using the saves.
Oh yeah, I should have asked.
I will not be using my save this week.
And I will not be using it as
Okay,
well
alrighty.
because the next 2 weeks are too important to save.
Yeah. I will say that just my general sentiment is that the next week is going to be difficult. I think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think it's going to be kind of difficult.
See,
Because
next week I get to drop first.
okay.
I feel less of a pressure
Yeah.
because I kind of already know
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
I'm gonna drop,
Yeah.
but you're gonna have a hard time with things. So, but yeah, these
Yeah.
are the remaining shows in the gauntlet. We've come pretty far. We are now 75% of the way through since we're week 9 out of 12.
Alrighty. Yeah. Um. The shows that are left, all pretty quality. I won't say that they're all like extremely good, but they all have a decent amount of quality as survivors at this point. Um, I think that especially as we're nearing the end, a lot of the final gradings, I think, for the Gauntlet champions, right, will, as to nobody's surprise, will really depend on how each of these shows finish up. I think that there are a theme for me in particular. I think when it comes to, let's say, when it comes to 86, when it comes to Kuikomo to a certain extent, when it comes to Snow White Notes, Taxi, Vivi, we have a decent amount of at least in my book there's a decent amount of predictability with how it's going to end. But
Oh,
there
really?
are also
I have no
okay.
idea how Odd Taxi is gonna end.
Okay, I think like, or rather, let me put it like this: it's not necessarily confidence and predictability of how it's going to end. I have a decent amount of confidence in the general direction, and because of that, I'm not predicting that they're going to have a severe quality drop. The shows I
Okay.
did not list on there, like I think, like namely, like Higehiro, I think Joran, Shadow's House, like Tokyo
Oh,
Revengers.
I see what you
I
mean.
think
Yeah, yeah.
those are the ones where there's a. I'm going to be keeping a particularly avid, like, weary eye on them because I think that whether they end up turning good or not heavily depends on how they execute, kind of like the remainder of the show.
Gotcha.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I
Yeah.
understand what you mean.
Yeah, yeah. I not to say that I'm Nostradamusing the plot contents, but rather I think that the way those other shows were set up, like I have enough confidence in them to like kind of at least have a general idea of like, okay, this is at least in a general ballpark, this is how the story is gonna go, and so I
Yeah,
have
yeah,
like at
yeah.
least some level of faith to say like, oh, it won't go like completely just like off the freaking rails, but yeah,
Yeah.
I will say for those
I
shows,
think
yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah, I will be keeping a very close eye. I do think that those shows that I am labeling kind of almost a little bit as a wild card, if they end up executing kind of like in the more optimistic sides of what we want, they could receive a really big boost. But if not, yeah, they'll definitely see a drop. So,
Yeah.
well, yeah.
If you go on to the next slide, we'll have a recap. Today we had 13 shows, drop two, and we only have 3 weeks left in this gauntlet. Next week we're only going to talk about 11 shows, dropping
Yeah.
two, maybe less, depending on if we use our saves. The week after, 9 shows, and the final week, 7 shows. Obviously, just thinking we're not going to use the saves, but highly
Yeah.
doubt that. And so yeah, we'll have it, and then we'll be selecting our gauntlet champions. Talk more about the format for that, but
Yeah.
essentially we'll be picking our gauntlet champions.
Yeah.
If you want to support us financially, we'll be on Patreon. Here's the link.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to join our Discord community and just to talk about any shows you are particularly interested in, or just want to talk to us about anime in general, the link is in the channel description.
Yep. Alrighty. Well, yeah. We're getting closer to the end. I think that definitely a lot of nuggets of goodness to watch, and yeah, I'm excited as these shows are getting close to the end. I'm almost a little bit bittersweet that some of these will be receiving the gauntlet knife, so to speak. But
Yeah.
it is a testament to overall like the enjoyability of the show. So time moves forward, right? The gauntlet moves forward, and so yeah, we'll see what happens with the show. Yeah, thanks for watching. And the show should be resuming the normal pace. And yeah, so we'll expect to see us around same time, same day next week. Alrighty.
Yeah. Peace.
Peace.